This is probably like the most common mistake I see producers making. This, however, is the most important thing to know about 808s. These are probably like the single biggest thing that separates average producers to industry producers. Alright, what's good, YouTube? So in this video, I'm going to be covering how industry producers make their drum patterns. Specifically, I'm going to be going over the essential drum patterns that every single producer should know. And I promise you, if there's one video that I make that you should watch from beginning to end, it's going to be this one. Because I'm going to be going over essential things that you need to know and not know when it comes to making your drum patterns as bouncy as possible. Specifically, I'm going to be going over the essential drum patterns that every producer must know and use, every common mistake that every producer seems to be making, tips on how to make your drums as bouncy as possible, some sound selection tips, as well as various tips and tricks along the way. And finally, before this video starts, make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse, as well as check out my drum kits at my BeatStars page. There will be a link in the description if you want to cop any of the drum kits that I've been using recently, or in the comments of this video. Alright, but let's get into the video. So what I'm going to do is go over every drum sound individually, starting with the 808. The 808 is going to be like the heart of your beat, and it's going to set like the framework for the rhythm that we create with our drums. The main thing to understand is this 808 pattern right here. This is one of the most fundamental things that every producer needs to know. The reason it's so important is because this pattern, or other variations of it, are being used in practically every single trap beat that's ever been made. So what I mean by variations is, for example, this, and this. In this case with the 808s, but really with all drum sounds, it's all about doing what feels right for the beat, but also understanding like which patterns work best for which types of sounds, you know, which ones flow right with the melodies. And that's why a lot of the times, like, you'll see that people will be doing their 808 patterns first when making the drums for a melody. If you're a really beginner, I definitely recommend starting with this 5-note 808 pattern and just like delete or shift the notes as you go. And what might help is, similar to like a metronome, what you can do and what you'll see a lot of producers doing, at least industry producers, is they'll start off by just adding like a simple 2-step hi-hat and clap pattern before they start their beat like this, and only then will they make the 808 pattern after. Okay, so once you've done that, you've got a basic framework for the rhythm that we're going to be building with the rest of our drum sounds. Also, a cool little trick you can try doing is like creating 808 rolls right at the end of the pattern to give it a little bit more of a bounce. If you saw the Metro Boomin tutorial, I talked about how he does this in a lot of the beats just to give them a little bit more bounce. Examples of this include this, and this. As you can tell, they tend to kind of like sit right at the end of the beat. Don't be like putting like crazy rolls like in between. That's what the hi-hats are for. As for choosing the right 808, and honestly as for choosing like the right drum sounds in general, make sure you have like a general idea of what you want it to sound like before you just go through like picking sounds randomly, because know that different sounds, depending on like length, attack, and all these features, are all going to have an impact on your rhythm, believe it or not. Using more tight as well as less 808s in your pattern is going to make them hit really hard. The reason being is that, think of it this way, what makes a sound hit hard is the decay relative to the sharpness of the attack. For example, the reason sub bass sounds have like very little rhythm to them is it's very difficult to distinguish when like a new note is being played, because there literally is no decay in the sub bass sound. The same thing explains why like using less 808s is going to make certain 808s hit harder than if you use just a bunch of 808s through your pattern, because it's going to give the 808 more time to decay, making it even sharper when a new 808 hits. Now, that being said, if you're asking like, dog, then why doesn't everyone use this by default for their beats? Well, the reason being is that you don't always want to have your drum sounds being like as tight as possible, you know, because you need to be able to create rhythm and bounce by using like a combination of like tight sounds and loose sounds, you know, like loud and quiet sounds and whatnot. It's all about like finding a balance between those two things. You know, you don't want everything just to be like insanely tight all the time. You know, you want to find a middle ground between those things. Okay, so the next thing is the snare. As for patterns, this is the general positions that you'll see most of the snares being put in beats. Variations of these patterns include this, and this. One common mistake I'll see a lot of people make is having their snare patterns be like ridiculously repetitive. So try, instead of just making like a basic 8-bar pattern and looping it throughout, I'd recommend try making your snare pattern more interesting by creating just like one note at a time with the melody that you're using. Also, just like with the 808, what you can do is try adding like snare rolls at the end of your beat to give it a little bit more bounce. Also, here's a little trick that's going to give your snares like way more bounce. Try not to instinctively layer your snares to hit on top of the clap all the time, as doing this can help give the beat like way more bounce if you give it little spaces where the clap hits separately from the snare and the snare hits separately from the clap. Example of very popular beats that do this trick is like Lucid Dreams, Mask Off, and I believe Ransom by Lil Tecca. Finally, one thing you can try doing is pitching your snares down by 1 semitone. This will give them a little bit more of like a darker feel. Also, do note that like lowering the pitch of like any drum sound is going to increase the duration, stretch them out, and you know, vice versa if you pitch them up. So, you know, if you want like a more like tight sound or a more loose sound, you can mess around with doing that kind of stuff. I know that like a lot of industry producers, for example, like Metro Boomin, will like tune and pitch their hi-hats, not by like semitones, but they'll just kind of like go up to the pitch knob. Like I'll actually open it. They'll go up to this like pitch knob up here, and they'll just kind of like tweak with this until it's like sitting just right with the hi-hat. So that's definitely something you can try out. So the next sound are perks. I'm not going to go over common positions for perks because they tend to be placed in like the exact same position as snares. But it really depends on like what type of sound you're using. Generally, I'd say that treat the perk like whichever drum sound it resembles the most. Meaning if like the sound is like a shaker, for example, treat it almost like an open hat. You know, if the sound is like a stomp, you should treat it more like a kick. And the sound is just like a regular rim shot, you should treat it like a snare and put it in those like respective patterns that I'm showing you. I will say a common mistake that a lot of people make is having like way too many perk sounds. Like realistically, I know it depends on the beat, but like most of the time you really shouldn't be using like more than 2 perk sounds. And don't just fill in like every empty space with perks, because then you'll just compromise like the rhythm of the beat and simplicity, and you're not going to leave any space for the artist, which is super important. The next thing is the claps. I mean, like, come on, this one's a no-brainer. You know, 99% of the time the claps are just going to sit in this generic 2-step pattern. I will say though that there's like one time where you should really make exception for this, and that's when you're making beats at like the lower like 100 or so tempos, you know, like the more like West Coast, you know, Taiga type beats. This is what those patterns look like. Yeah, but that's really all you need to know for claps. It's super basic. So the next thing is the kicks. The kicks are also pretty basic, but when implementing a kick pattern, just ensure that that pattern you use is either like identical or at least very similar to the 808 pattern that you already made. So in other words, what I strongly recommend doing is just copying your 808 pattern, then open the piano roll, highlight everything, and then hit Alt and K on your keyboard. What that will do is it's going to drop all the notes along like C5, and from there you can do as you please by just like deleting or shifting or adding more kicks to your liking. Generally, one thing you'll see a lot of producers do to give the beats a little bit more bounce is they'll space their kicks to either hit before or after the 808 in certain points, just to give it a little bit more bounce. Again, that's another thing I talked about in the Metro Boomin tutorial. Also, if you're using like an 808 roll, I'd strongly recommend not having your kicks roll as well, but instead trying just using one kick that hits right before the roll instead, because it's going to sound a little bit weird and it's just going to overlap and clip like crazy. So the next thing is the open hats. This is also super basic. These are the main positions that you'll see open hats being placed. There's not really many types of like patterns you can do with open hats, but the most common ones are these 3: this, and this. Again, if you're using like a Vox sound or another perk sound that sounds similar to an open hat, then the same idea applies, and you should try and use like these general patterns or positions for those sounds as well. Okay, last but certainly not least, we have the hi-hats. These are probably like the single biggest thing that separates average producers to industry producers. There's a lot to understand about them, and what I'm going to do is like break down everything you need to know. So first off, what you want to always do is start off with your basic 2-step pattern. Open the piano roll, click this magnet time signature selector, and select 1/3 step. You don't have to use 1/3 step, but it's probably like the most common time signature that the vast majority of producers use. So for making hi-hat rolls, there's 2 common methods. 1, using the paintbrush tool and drawing them in like this, or 2, simply dragging the hi-hats with your mouse like this. Also, here's 2 techniques that are going to make your workflow like twice as fast. Instead of just like switching between time signatures to create different kinds of rolls, 2 methods you can do is either highlight a note where you want a roll to be placed and hit Alt plus U on your keyboard to create a 1/4 hi-hat roll. Also, what you can do is simply draw out the amount of notes you want for your hi-hat roll and simply highlight the notes that you already made and then drag them to be as long as you wish. As for common mistakes that I see people making, one of the biggest ones I see for hi-hats is having like way too many types of hi-hat rolls. This is probably like the most common mistake I see producers making, and it just completely throws the artist off. So to avoid doing this, a good practice, especially for beginners, is just to find a hi-hat roll that works for your beat and flows really well, and try highlighting it and just dragging it and copying and pasting it to wherever you see fit, basically forcing yourself to be repetitive. Think of it like each type of hi-hat roll is in a sense like a perk, that having too many types of perks you can create like a unique rhythm, but the pacing and flow of that rhythm is going to be like all over the place, and it's going to be really hard to rap on. The key is rather to trick the listener into thinking that the drums are like very unique by creating like subtle but effective variation. Kind of like what I was talking about with like 808s and snare rolls. And you know, also, and vice versa, don't make your hi-hats like ridiculously simple. Like sure, that can work sometimes, but like don't default to like using those basic 2-step hi-hat patterns that don't even require for you to go in the piano roll to make. I'd say for the most time, look for a balance between like not too simple and not too complicated. I will say, however, one of the most common tips to create bounce with your hi-hats, you'll see this a lot in like Memphis music or like from producers like Pierre Bourne, Take Keith, and Metro Boomin, is that they'll have this basic like 2-step hi-hat pattern lead into the snare like this. So if you listen, when the hi-hats hit and overlay with the snare, it just kind of like gives it like additional bounce. It's really cool with the beat. Also, a lot of the times what you'll see industry producers do is they'll have their hi-hat rolls intentionally placed where the 808 hits, because that also gives it like a really unique groove when you do that. Yeah, but that's going to be it for individual drum sounds. As for general or like common mistakes I see producers making, don't make your overall drum patterns too simple or overly complex. Avoid having like too many different types of spacings between your drum sounds, and try and keep like the gaps in between each like more consistent. Another mistake is having like too many drum sounds, especially in today's day and age where like beats have just gotten like more and more simple. I'd say a good rule of thumb is like avoid having like more than like 8 or so drum sounds in your beats. If you look at like the biggest hit songs all these industry producers are making, they really don't use like that many drum sounds, so I don't know why you should. Another common mistake is that producers won't understand the importance of leveling your drum sounds. Either they'll have their drum sounds like not leveled relatively to each other, or their drums just will be like way too quiet altogether. You gotta make sure that your drums are louder than your melody and not like sitting or even like below it. I have a full video on mixing beats where I break this stuff down more in depth, and I strongly recommend watching it if you haven't already. And last but definitely the most common mistake of them all is using bad sounds. Practically everything I've talked about so far in this video means nothing if the sounds you use are bad. So I'd strongly recommend like using good drum sounds, which is probably what I'm going to be going over in my next video, which I promise will come out shortly. I actually have my own drum kits which consist of really good sounds that I've been collecting for years of making beats. So if you want any of these sounds, there's going to be a link to my store page either in the description of this video or in the comments. But that's going to be it for this tutorial. Apologies for being gone so long. I promise that it's something of the past, and I plan on uploading more consistently from now on. I feel like this current format of videos I've been making is not only like a little bit stale, but the time and effort it takes for me to make one of these videos is not something I can consistently do. And I'd rather be consistent than like drop like a video randomly like once a week or like once a month, or like all of a sudden like back-to-back videos. You know what I mean? I want to be consistent, so I'm gonna make simpler videos and more different stuff on this channel. But yeah, if you really want to support this channel, make sure to follow my Instagram and Twitter at FinnaFinesse. That's super important to me. You can keep up with what I'm doing, as well as participate in giveaways and voting on what videos I do next. So yeah, make sure to check that out. And yeah, apart from that, make sure to like the video, subscribe, and peace. Testing. Testing my microphone. Testing. Does my microphone work? Testing. Can you all hear me?